Good day, learners. Welcome to Technical Mathematics lesson. My name is Matule Latakomo. This lesson is brought to you by Sci-Bono Discovery Center in collaboration with Gauteng Department of Education. Welcome back, grade 11s. Our topic for today is interpretation of functions and graphs. So let's look at our lesson objectives. At the end of this lesson, learners must be able to interpret graphs, interpret the statement given, and understand the effects of parameters. So that's what we will be looking at today. So now let's look at our two of the important things that you need to know when we're interpreting our functions. We have the domain, and we also have what we call the range. And the domain and range of which function? Of the function of f of x. So now, when we're speaking about domains, we speak of x values, which are the input. So you know that x values are the input of what? Of your f of x, which can be represented by what? By y as well. Remember, f of x can be represented by y. It's the same thing. So now, when we're talking about the range, we're talking about the output. And output represents the what? The y values. Remember, we said domain is x values, and our range, we're talking about y values. So we will talk more when we're interpreting our graph about domain and range. Okay, now we have to find the intercepts of the graph. So now, when we find the intercept of the graph, in this case, they will sketch the graph for you. They will give you the sketched graph, and then you must now interpret your graph, and then you will have to determine the x-intercept and y-intercept. So they say, let's look at how we go about finding x-intercepts and y-intercepts. To find x-intercept of a graph, we let y to be 0, and we solve for the equation for x. And then when we're looking for the y-intercept, remember, to find the y-intercept of the graph, then we're going to now let our x to be equal to 0, and we solve the equation to find y. So those are the few things that we have to look into and remember them as we answer our questions. Okay. So now, activity 1. In this case, remember, we're talking about interpreting the functions. Then they are going to sketch the functions for you. Then we start by reading our statement, which is the very important thing to do. Okay, the statement reads as follows. Sketched below are the graphs of functions defined by h of x is equal to 2x plus c, which is the first equation that is, the first functions that is given. Then the second function, they're saying p of x is equal to the square root of r squared minus x squared. So those are the two functions that are given. So now there are bullets there. They're saying m, n, and t are the intercept of p. M, n, and t are the intercept of p. And then we have the graph, the function of p there. And then they're saying s and t, which s, which is -3 and 0, are now the intercept of the function of h. So now, the two graphs are sketched for you. The important thing is to identify what types of graphs are they. Correct. So Now, we can see this one by looking at it that this is a straight line, correct? It's our straight line function or graph. And then now, looking at the other one, you can see that this one is your semicircle, correct? So we have two graphs there. One we have identified that is a straight line, and the other one is a semicircle. So it's also important that on your statement you determine or you identify which one is a straight line and which one is your semicircle. So obviously we know that the graph of P is your semicircle and the graph of H is your straight line. And it even indicated that H is a straight line and P is a semicircle. So that's how you interpret the statement with the given sketch before you can even go to your questions. So those are the basic things that learners must know when they answer this type of questions. Okay? And you also look at the information given, whether it corresponds to the graphs. So they said M, N, and T are the intercept of P. And then we have M, we have N, and we have T there. And of course, they are the intercept of P. So with S and T, those are the intercept of H. Here there is S, and that one also is an intercept of H. So now, what do we know, or what can we say about T? We can see that the point T, it belongs in the two graphs, the graph of the straight line and the graph of your semicircle. So it means the straight line and the semicircle, they share the coordinate of P there. So those are the things that you have to look into when we are answering this type of questions. You interpret what is given first before you answer or you go and read your questions. So now, let's go and look at our questions. So the first question is said, we must determine the numerical value of C, correct? And looking at the statement, we can see that C is on the equation of the straight line. So we have to determine that value of C. Then the second question, we say write down A, the coordinate of M, B, the equation of P, and C, the domain of P. And remember, on our notes, we said the domain, we're talking about X values. So those are the things that learners must remember, that when we're talking about domain, we're talking about X values. And when we're talking about range, we're talking about Y values. So now, let's see how do we answer our questions. So the question says determine the value, the numerical value of C, correct? And we know from our statement that C, it was in the graph of a straight line, which is given by 2x plus C. So now, how am I going to determine the value of C? We go to our straight line, and on the graph of a straight line, we have to look for one point that will help us to determine the value of C. Remember, I have the three unknown variables when the equation is given like this. I explained that h of x can be written as y, and then we have 2x plus c. So in this case, you can see that I have three unknown, which is y, x, and c. And we have to determine the value of c. But on the graph of a straight line, that graph of a straight line there, we were given that the intercept is t and S. And then at S we have information there. A point of X and Y, which is S. So what are we going to do? We're going to say S is -3 and 0. And then X and Y. Then for us to determine the value of C, I will substitute. My Y is 0. It's equal to 2 into -3 plus C. So now you can see that at this point, I have only one unknown, which is what? Which is C. Then we can make C the subject of the formula. So we'll know that's going to be 0. It's equal to -6 plus C. Therefore, your C is going to be 6, as I'm transposing this -6 to the left-hand side. Remember, it jumps the equal sign, then it becomes positive. So we can say the numerical value of C is 6. Correct? Then now, what does it tell us? It means that h of x is equal to 2x plus 6. Correct? Then that's how we determine that numerical value of C. Let's go to our next question. So now, the next question there is given that we must write down the coordinate of M, and we must also determine write down the equation of P and also the domain of P. So now, when we go back to our sketch, the original sketch, now we know what is our value of C. So it's 2x plus 6, correct? And now, looking at this graph of a semicircle, correct? We know that from 0 going to n, we have a radius there. And from 0 going to m, we also have a radius. And from 0 going to t, we also have what we call a radius there. So that is a semicircle. And the distance of ON, OT, and OM, they are equal in length. But now, how am I going to get the radius now? Remember, the question says we must determine the value of what? Of M. So now, how am I going to get the radius? We can see that for us to get the radius, the graph of the straight line, which is H, it has enough information for us to determine the radius. Now, how am I going to determine that radius then? We will say, let's look for the y-intercept of our straight line. So we know that when we say y-inter, we let x to be 0. Then now we're going to have what? We're going to have y is equal to 2 into 0 plus 6. Therefore, y is going to be what? Is going to be 6. So, given that, we know that the distance from O to T is 6. It means our radius there is equal to 6. So, if our radius is equal to 6, it means this side is, we're talking about positive x values, we're going to get 6. And our radius this side talking about negative values, we're going to have negative 6. So now, we can go and check our question. The question says we must write down the coordinate of M. And then with what I have shown you here, that for us to get M, remember the distance from O to M, O to T, and O to N are equal in length. Correct. So now, for the coordinate of N, we're going to have 6 and 0, because from 0 going to your right, we're talking about positive x values. And from your 0 going to your left, we're talking about negative x values. It means the coordinate of m there is going to be negative 6 and 0. So now, when we go and write down the equation of m, we're going to have, the coordinate, we're going to have negative 6 and 0. So you see, there is a lot of interpretation that is happening for you to get into the answer. Now, we have the coordinate of m, which is negative 6 and 0. And now we have to determine or write down the equation of p. From the statement given, we can see that p of x is equal to the square root of r squared minus x squared. And now we know what is our r. Our r is 6. So we will have to go to our equation of p of x. Where we see r, we substitute 6. So now we can simply go to saying p of x is equal to the square root of r squared minus x squared. So now, where we see r, we substitute 6 squared minus x squared. So now, we can conclude that the equation of p of x is going to be the square root of 36 minus x squared, because you can't separate the two inside the square root. And 6 squared is like 6 times 6, which is 36. So that's how you write down the equation of p. Now, we're talking about the domain. Remember the domain, guys. We're talking about x values. And what does it mean? It means we must give the values of, the domain, which is the values of x, where p is defined. So now, if we can go to our graph, we know that the coordinate of m is negative 6 and 0. And the coordinate of n is 6 and 0. The coordinate of t is 0 and 6. Correct. But now, when we're talking about the domain, we're only talking about the x values. So, the domain is the x values. And it means we must determine the values of x where p is defined. That is the domain. The domain is the values of x where the graph of p is defined. So we can see that the graph of p is defined from negative 6 up until n there. Beyond n and below m, that graph is not defined. So now, when we write the domain of this graph, we're going to say x is element of square bracket, because the values of negative 6 and 6 are included. So now we start with the smallest one, which is what? Negative 6, and then it ends at 6. So that's how we determine the domain. The domain is defined from negative 6 to 6. That's where now we determine the domain. We're talking about where the graph of P is defined. Correct. So now that's how we answer this type of questions. Okay, let's go to activity number 2. Remember, it's important for our learners to read the statement and interpret the statement according to what is given there in our graphs. Okay, the statement reads as follows. The sketched below are the graphs of functions of f and g defined by f of x is equal to x squared minus 4x minus 5, and g of x is equal to mx plus c. So now we have the information in f of x, and we don't have the information in g of x. Most of the time when the question are being asked, you look at the graph that has the enough information. And in this case, you can see that the function of f of x, it has enough information. So now, the bullet number 1, it tells you that t is the turning point of f, and of which we know, or we can see that t, there is a turning point. Then point A, B, and P, which is 0 and -5, are the intercept of f. So we can see that we have A and B, which lies on the x-intercept, or on the x-axis, which are x-intercept of f. And now we have P, which lies on the y-axis of f. It means P is the x-intercept of f, and A and B are the x-intercept of f. P is the y-intercept, sorry, it's a y-intercept. So now, Q is the reflection of P about the line x is equal to 2. So they're saying P is the reflection of Q. Along which line? Along that line of y is equal to, x is equal to 2. And we said it in our previous lesson that this is axis of symmetry. That line is axis of symmetry. And axis of symmetry, remember, it divides our function into 2 equal parts. Axis of symmetry divide our function into, or graph, into 2 equal parts. Yeah, it divides our graph into 2 equal parts. It means the distance from this value, which is 2, from 2 to A and from 2 to B, those distances there, they are equal. Now, it means the distance from 2, which is the value of x, to the value of x there at P, and from 2, from the value of x to the value of x at Q, those distances are equal. So that's how the axis of the symmetry help us to determine those type of points on the graph. Okay? So now A and Q are the points where F and G are equal. A and Q are the points where F and G are equal. So looking at this, we can see that A is an intercept of the graph of F and the graph of G. And also Q, it's also the intercept of what? Of the graph of F and the graph of G. So by reading the statement and interpreting it from my graphs, that's what learners should know or do when they answer this type of questions. Read the statement, interpret from the graph. And from the graph, you also indicate what you know, like your axis of the symmetry, and then interpret how it works. And then you're looking at your A and B are the x-intercept, P is your y-intercept, and you are also given the turning point. So now, we can go and read our questions. Looking at our first question there, they say write down the range of F, 1 mark. B, you must write down the coordinate of Q, 2 marks. That is number 1. Number 2, we must determine the x-intercept of F, 3 marks. B, hence, write down the length of AB. So we can see that you will have to determine the intercept. After determining the intercept, you must determine the length of AB. And already we have interpreted what is A and B. Okay, so now looking at the number 3, we must determine the numerical values of M and C, 3 marks. And then now, number 4, it says write down the values of x for which f of x multiplied by g of x is greater than 0. So this is where now we interpret our functions or our graphs. When we get there, I will explain how to do that type of equation. So now, without any waste of time, let's go to the first one. Okay, now we must write down the range of f. We have the graph of f, correct? That is the graph of f. And we said when we're talking about the range, we're looking at the y values. We're looking at the y values. So now, looking at the y values, it means we're looking at the values that are on this line, the y axis. And we check where the graph is defined. Remember, when we're determining the domain and range, we're looking at where the graph is defined on both x and y values. In this case, we're looking at the y values because we are talking about the what? The range. So, we can see that this point, we have y is equal to -9 because x is 2, y is -9. Then, from -9 going downward, we don't have a graph. At this point, we don't have a graph. So it means the graph of f, it tends at -9. It means that graph is defined from -9 going upward. We can see that here we have y values. We have y values. At P, the y value is 5. We have y values going upward. We don't know where they are going to end. So, when we write our range, remember range we're saying where the graph is defined on the y values. So, the graph is defined on the y values from where? From -9. So, how am I going to write my range? Range is going to be y is greater or equal to -9. What it means? It means y, the values of y, the range values of y, they start from -9. Remember, -9 is included. We do count -9. We're saying from -9 going upward. It means it's -8, -7, -6, -5, up until positive y values to infinity. We don't know where this graph will end. But that's how you determine the range. Remember, you're looking at where the graph is defined. Okay? Now, we have to write down the coordinate of Q. So, by writing down the coordinate of Q, it was given that P and Q are reflecting along x is equal to 2. So, x is equal to 2 is our the line of symmetry. So, now, what do we know? We know that at y-intercept, this point here is 0. Are we together? The x value there of P is 0. So the point there is 0. It's 0. So we have 2 here, correct? And we also have the x value of Q, which is unknown. But how are we going to get the x value of q, because we can tell that the y value of q is going to be -5. It's reflecting, isn't it? So this point P and point Q, they both share the y value, which is -5. The only difference there is the x values. But how are we going to get our x values? So we can count that from 0 to 2, we have 2 units. It means there's supposed to be 1. Then when we move, we say 1, 2. Correct. So now, if we move 2 units to the left for us to get the x values of P, we also need to move 2 units to the right for us to get the x values of Q. That's how axes of the symmetry help us. Now, I'm going to move 2 units to the right. So from 2 is going to be 3 and 4. So it means that value of x of q is 4. It means q is 4 and -5. So that's how you get the coordinate of q, which is 4 and -5. That's how we interpret this type of graphs. So you can see that the axis of the symmetry is important in this type of questions, or to know how to interpret the axis of the symmetry, which is the y value of the, the x value of the turning point. Right. So moving forward now to the second one, number 2. Now here they say we must determine the x-intercept of f. So we know that x-intercept is a and b. But how do we get the x-intercept? We go to our statement. It is given in full that the graph of f is equal to x squared minus 4x minus 5. So now, how are we going to determine the x-intercept? Y is equal to negative, not negative, is x squared minus 4x minus 5. And then when we determine for the x-intercept, we know that y have to be 0. So where there is y, we substitute 0. We're going to have x squared minus 4x minus 5. Then now we can see that it's in a quadratic equation. So when we have quadratic equation, always we have to use quadratic formula. I know there are most of the learners who knows how to factorize. We can factorize at this point, but to be on a safe side, and you're still struggling with factorization in terms of determining the sign and factors of 5, that can give you 4. Then we go for quadratic formula. So remember, quadratic formula says x is equal to minus b plus minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. That's how you will write there. Then from there, what do? We're going to now substitute our values. B, remember, is represented by 4, negative 4. Then we also have negative 4 there. Then A is the coefficient of x squared, which is 1. And C is a constant, which is negative 5. Then our A again is what? It's y. Then now we're going to have 2 values of x from there. We're going to have 2 values of x. So now, on how do we determine that now? We have our calculator, and on our calculator, Now I want to show you how to how to punch this equation. You start with your fraction, then you saying negative, you open bracket, you close, and you saying plus the square root, you open, you close, you have squared. You minus it by 4, open, close, you go down, you have 2, you open and you close. So you can see that by having this, it's the equation of quadratic equation. Then from there, you go move your arrows. You go to your first bracket. Our first bracket, we have -4. So I'm going to substitute -4 there. Correct. And we go to the one of squared. We also substitute -4. Then now we move to the one of a, and our a we know that is 1, and our c is -5. Then you go and you substitute 1 there. So you can see how I have substituted. Then now, when you press your equal sign, what does it mean? Oh, sorry, we use this negative here. Yeah, correct. So when you're saying equal to, the first x values that we get there is what? Is 5. Correct? Then how do we get the second x value? We go to your function, to your calculator. Let's see. We have negative into -4. Then now we put negative. Then the square root of -4 squared minus 4 into 1 and -5. All over 2 into 1. So, remember the first part, we had positive in front of the square root. Now we have negative. So when you say equal to, you have the next x value of what? As -1. So now, that's how you use your calculator to punch your quadratic formula. Now we have 5 and -1. We can see that A is from negatives. And then a B is supposed to be +5. Correct. So that's how you determine the x-intercepts using your quadratic formula. If you know how to factorize, it's still fine. You can factorize and get your values there of x. So now, they said we must hence determine, write down the length of AB. Remember, the length of AB is from A2 to B. And if we check, it was like 1 mark. So now, you can still count from A to B. How many units are there? Because if this is -1, it means you're going to have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So now, let's count the units that are there. So we have how many units? From A, -1, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we can confidently say AB is equal to 6 units. Even if you use your distance formula, you will still get 6. So what I've done there is one of the interpretation of determining the length using the given graphs. So it's as simple as ABC, guys. It's like that. Now, let's move forward. We now know what is the value, the coordinate of q? Negative 4 and 5. We know b, which is 5 and 0. We know a is negative 1 and 0. Correct? Then now, we have to determine the numerical value of m and c. Remember, m and c, they are from g of x, it's equal to mx plus c, which is a straight line. Then we know that m is your gradient. M is your gradient. Then how do we determine the gradient? It's simple. We go and look for the gradient formula in our information sheet. So m for gradient is equal to y2 minus y1 all over x2 minus x1. Correct? Then we now have 2 points that are passing through your straight line. Looking at those points, straight line there, we have q, we have a there. Correct? So now, this can be x1, and y1. This one is going to be x2 and y2. So now, we use the bracket when we substitute. y2 is 5. y1 is 0. x2 is negative 4. x1 is negative 1. That's what we have. Then now, in this case, what is it that we're going to have when we're determining the gradient there? Remember, we said it's negative 5, not 5. Ne? Sorry, it's negative 5. It's negative 5. This one is 4. It's not negative, it's 4. So now, we're going to have negative 5 all over 5. Correct. Then now, therefore, the gradient is going to be negative 1. Remember, your 4 is positive and your 5 is negative. We can still double check that from the question where we determine the coordinate of q. We said x is 4, y is negative 5. So here, our coordinate is 4 and negative 5. So which is your x1 and, x2 and y2. So your y2 is negative 5, correct substitution. Your y1 is 0, correct substitution. Your x2 is 4, correct substitution. And your x1 is negative 1, correct substitution. So if you punch it inside the calculator, you're going to get what? Negative 1. 100%. So now, for us to get c, because now we have m, we're going to substitute y is equal to minus 1 x plus c. So remember, it's like we're determining the equation of a straight line. We can either take a or q, the coordinate of a and the coordinate of q. So if I take the coordinate of q, our y is 0 and negative 1 into negative 1 plus c. Remember, I substituted x and y. In this case, my c is going to be 1 plus c. So if I transpose this one this side, therefore, c is going to be negative 1. So that's how you determine the numerical values of m and c. For us to get m, we use gradient, then we substitute it where there is m then. Then from there, we're looking for one point. Either you can take Q or A. You substitute where there is X and Y to get the value of what? Of C. Sorry. That's how you interpret this type of a function. Sorry. Now, number 4, we write down the values of x for which f of x multiplied by y of x is greater than 0. So guys, remember f of x is y. Also here, g of x is y. And then if you multiply these two values of y, you must have a positive sign. Remember, any number that is greater than 0 which is positive, correct? So now, in this case, when we interpret our graphs, let's look at the graphs and we identify from the two functions, where do we get positives y values and where do we get negative y values. So, looking at the graph of f, we know that from here we have positive values, because from here going up we have positive values. From 0 going up we have positive values. We have positive values up until a. Then from there the y values start to be negative. The y values, they start to be negative. So now, from b now, the y values start to be what? Positive. Right? Looking at the one now for g, here we have positive. When they get to a, we start having what? Negatives. We start having negatives. So now, remember, when we multiplying the sign, we say positive multiplied by positive is going to be positive. Negative multiplied by negative is going to be positive. So, for this question, where f of x multiplied by g of x will give you greater than 0, which is positive, it means we must have cases where positive of the y value of f of x, it must be positive. And the y value of g of x, it must be positive. Then we're going to have positive. On the x values. Correct. So now, what I mean here, or what I'm trying to say here, is that looking at this interval, we know that x is equal to -1, right? And then now, here, x is equal to 5. So, from -1 going to your left-hand side, we have positive of both g and f. So, it means x will be less than -1. That is the first condition, because we have positive multiplied by positive. We have positive of f multiplied by the positive of g. Then from -1 going that side, we are going to have positive values, because we are multiplying positive and positive. Now, from -1, right, we have both negative values of f and g, f and g, f and g, f and g, up until what? Up until 5. So it means from -1 to 5, we have negative values of G and F. And if we multiply them, they're going to give us what? Positive. But looking from 5 going that side, G remains as negative, but F changes to positive. So if you're saying positive multiplied by negative, you're going to get negative. It means this interval here is not applicable. So now, the only two intervals that are applicable is the one of less than 1 and between -1 and 5. So that's how you interpret this type of function. I hope it was clear, this one. Okay. Question 4. I must repeat it from scratch. Okay. So, with this type of a question, guys, we're interpreting the functions. And the simplest way, what happened now? But I can't see my screen from this side. It just went. Okay. Yes, thank you. So now, I'm saying here we're looking at y values. Remember, we're determining, we write down the values of x for which the values of y, when you multiply them, they must give you a positive number. Why am I saying positive? It's because greater than 0, you have positive values. I hope that one is clear. Remember, f of x is y, g of x is y, but we're using y values to determine the values of x. So, from our function or Cartesian plane, we know that below this 0 on the y-intercept, here we have negatives. Moving up, we have positives. Now, this graph here is above, I'm talking now about the graph of f. From A going up, that graph, it has positive values of y. Now, when it goes down, it will have now negative values of y up until b, because it's below this line of x going down is negatives. So now, starting here going upward is going to be positive values. Now, looking at the one for the straight line, moving from A going this side, we have positive values there. Why? Because it's above. Now, from A going now that side, we have negative values. The y values are negatives there. Correct. So now, I said the condition where we can have positive, it's when we multiply positive multiplied by positive, which will be positive. Or when you multiply negative multiplied by negative, which is going to be negative. So in this case, we know, or we have determined the values of A, where x was -1. And then here, we determined the values or the coordinate of B, where x was equal to 5. Now you understand the y values, where I'm speaking about y values. Now, we're looking at the x values. From the x values, remember the question says we must determine the x values. Where, when I multiply the y values, I must have greater than 0, which is positive. Now, in this case, you can see that from this -1 going to the left, I have positive values there of y and positive values of g. It means x less than 1. The values of x, the values of y, when I multiply them, they are going to give me positive. Because these two graphs here, they are both positive here. These two graphs, they are both positive. Their values are positive on y values. The y values of this graph from -1 going side, they are both positive. That's why I'm saying you will get greater than 0, which is positive. Remember, multiplying positive and positive, which is positive, and then is greater than 0. When x values are less than 1, it means we're talking about -2, -3, -4, up until -infinity. Now, another interval, it's which one? It's the one now I'm having negative values, y values of g, and negative y values of f. From where now? From A to B, which is 5. Then, if I say negative multiplied by negative is positive, negative multiplied by negative is positive, negative multiplied by negative, you see, up until B, then you get negative multiplied by negative, which is positive, which is positive. So now, the values of x, where you multiply the y values of f and g, and you get positive, the next interval is -1 up until 5. It means the x values from -1 up until 5. If I were to multiply their y values, I am going to get positive answers. But now, from B going that side, we can see that here is positive and that one is negative. If I say positive multiplied by negative, I will get negative. Hence, that interval from B greater than 5 is not defined. It's not applicable, actually. So that's how we answer this type of question. In most of the papers in grade 11 and grade 12, you find this type of questions. They call them level 4 questions. It means it's high order question where learners have to interpret the given function and then they get their answers. So it will be wise for learners to practice more questions on this. And not all the time they will come in positive. Sometimes they can say f of x multiplied by g of x and then less than 0. When they say less than 0, it means you're talking about what? About negatives. And in this case, if we want to talk about negatives, we're going to look at from 5 going that side. It means your answer is going to be x is greater than 5, because that's where you multiply positive and negative to get what? To get negative. I hope it was clear. Okay, thank you. Okay, now, activity 3. Now, in activity 3, guys, remember in these cases, we read the statement, and you must read the statement carefully, and then you interpret it with your graph there. So now, they say the diagram below represent the graphs of the functions defined by f of x. By a graph given like that, which is unknown, you must know what type of a graph is that. In this case, we know, we have done graphs. This is hyperbola. It's hyperbola. Correct. And you must also know the shape of hyperbola. And now, which graph again? G of x is equal to mx plus c. That is a straight line. Correct. So now, the first point there, it says r is negative 2 and 4. It's a point on f. R. It's negative 2 and 4. A point on f. It's correct. The information given there is correct when you interpret it with the graph. So G is the line of symmetry of f for which the cuts the y values at 2. So automatically they are telling you that the axis of the symmetry, correct, of this function, it cuts the values at what? At 2. And remember how we determine the axis of the symmetry. We're looking at from original, where y is equal to x, the reflection out again. So if this graph now it moved 2 units, we increasing the value of c, which is going to be what? 2. And by the way, by just explaining that, I've given one of the questions and answer already. Because now we are talking about the positive gradient. This line, it is a positive gradient. It started from y is equal to x. For the fact that it moved 2 units upward, it means we increase the value of what? Of c. Correct. Now, w is the x-intercept of f. P is point V is on G, such that VW is parallel to the x-axis. Okay? Now it's fine. Let's move now forward. The first question, we must determine the equation of f. You can see that the equation of f is unknown variables. So we must determine that equation. In this case, we must also understand the asymptote because Q represents the asymptote. In this case, our asymptote y is equal to 2. So Q is the value of 2. So those are the things that you have to look into when we are interpreting. Okay. So we must determine the equation of f, write down the equation of g, and write down the range of f, determine the coordinate of w, and determine the coordinate of v. Now, when we look at this explanation that is given, already I've determined the equation of g. By interpreting already, I've answered one of the questions. Hence, it's even 1 mark because there you don't have to determine the gradient. Okay, let's now determine the equation of f. Remember the equation of f, it was given by a over x plus q. So now, we agree that y is equal to 2, which is the equation of the asymptote. In this case, q is equal to 2. So we're going to have y a all over x plus 2. Now, on the graph of f, because we are determining the equation of f, we must identify a point on that graph, of which we do have a point. Remember, in this case, we have 3 unknowns. 1, 2, 3 unknowns. And I can't solve for a when I have 3 unknowns. But r, it has x and y, which y is your 4, and x is negative 2, which is going to be a all over negative 2 plus 2. So, by substituting the coordinate of r, we have now one unknown, which is A, and I will make A the subject of the formula. I will now transpose. So it's going to be 4 minus 2 is equal to A over 2. Then 4 minus 2 is 2. It's equal to A over negative 2. You divide by 1, you cross multiply. A multiplied by 1 is A. Then 2 multiplied by negative 2 is negative 4. Therefore, the graph of what? Of f is going to be negative 4 all over x plus 2. That's how you determine the equation. So now, the second one, Mr. Cosmos. The second one, we write down the equation of G. Remember, I said from the line of symmetry, we have y is equal to x. We moved this graph 2 units upward. It means now we increased the value of c, which is going to be 2. Y is equal to x plus 2. That's how you write down the equation of G. Now, we write down the range of f. Remember, the range of f, we're talking about y values, where the graph is defined. So now, in this case, when you're talking about y values, you want to say first, y is element of all real numbers. But y, it can be your asymptote. Remember, asymptote is something that it is not defined. Asymptote, you can't define the asymptote. So that's how you determine the range. On this graph, all values of y, they are defined. But when they get to 2, that's where now we find these values being undefined. So that's how we determine now the range, the range of this graph. We say y is element of all real numbers, but when it gets to 2, it's undefined altogether. So that's how we work that one out. Okay, now we have to determine the coordinate of W. And looking at W, we can see that W is the x-intercept of f. So we have the graph of f, which is negative 4 all over x plus 2. Then how are we going to get our W? W we said is the x-intercept. So we're going to simply say x-inter y is equal to 0. So we're going to say 0 is equal to negative 4 all over x plus 2. As we transpose, we're going to have negative 2 is equal to negative 4 over x. So now you will cross multiply. When you cross multiply, negative 2x is equal to negative 4. So you divide both sides by negative 2. Therefore, x is going to be 2. So W is 2 and 0. That's how you get the coordinate of W. But looking at W here, they said is parallel to this line of axis, y-axis. So it means they carry the same value of x. For W and V, their values of x is what? Is 2. So now, Looking at this one, it's supposed to be V there. Looking at the values of the coordinate of V, we said W is 2 and 0. V is 2 and we don't know. But we know the equation of G, which is y is equal to x plus 2. So for us to get the y values of G, we can simply substitute x by 2. So it's going to be y is equal to 2 plus 2. The 2 is the one for x here. Then when you're saying 2 plus 2, which is going to be 4. Therefore, the coordinate of V is going to be 2n and 4. So that's how we simply interpret this type of functions. So this is the end of the lesson. We learn by repetition. Remember, for you to understand this thing better, you must go and repeat them. Then thank you.